How does an entire family disappear in plain sight for nearly a century, only to be uncovered generations later, sealed inside a barn they called home? Tonight, we open a case that defies logic, a story that turned from local investigation to national record. The Ward family and the hidden world they built, locked away from everyone. Before we begin, take a moment to write down the time and location you're watching from in the comments below, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and like this video to support our work as we uncover stories history tried to bury. What investigators found inside that decaying structure was not just tragedy, it was design. Every beam, every wall, every record pointed to one impossible truth. Someone had built a world meant never to be seen. Who would plan such a thing? And how could a system like this continue generation after generation without anyone noticing? This is not folklore. This is a documented reality, one that reshaped state law, exposed a century of silence, and revealed the lengths one man went to preserve what he believed was purity. But before we begin, tell us in the comments that where are you watching from, and what time is it over there right now? And if you're drawn to real stories like this one, stories that were never meant to be told, make sure to like this video and subscribe to X Archives. On the morning of April 16, 1997, the Marion County Sheriff's Department logged an anonymous call concerning a remote property outside Salem, Oregon. The voice on the line was calm but brief, reporting only that something wasn't right on the old Ward farm. Deputies were dispatched within the hour. The location, listed as inactive since the mid-1980s, sat 5 miles from the nearest paved road. Fields overtaken by weeds. A sagging mailbox marked only with a W. The first responding unit arrived at 9:42 a.m. The driveway had long since disappeared beneath overgrowth. Tires crunched over gravel that had not been disturbed in years. No smoke, no movement, no sign of habitation. The farmhouse itself stood weathered but intact. Behind it, half hidden by alder trees, the deputies noticed a separate structure. A barn sealed from the outside with rusted chains and warped timber. Procedure required a perimeter sweep. They circled the property, noting broken fencing, stacked lumber, and an abandoned well. The air near the barn was dense and sour, carrying the unmistakable odor of decay. At first they suspected animal remains. Then they heard movement, faint, uneven, coming from within. One deputy called out, no answer. They tried the doors. Both were bolted shut with heavy brackets and metal pins driven into the frame. Backup was requested, and within 30 minutes additional personnel arrived along with county investigators. The decision to enter was made at 10:37 a.m. The first attempt with bolt cutters failed. The steel had fused to the hinges. A portable saw was used to remove the lock entirely. When the doors finally swung open, the interior air escaped with a force that made several officers step back. What they saw inside stopped them mid-motion. In the gloom, lit only by light seeping through gaps in the wood, several figures sat along the wall. They did not speak or move. The women appeared undernourished, their skin pale and hair matted, clothing little more than remnants of cloth. The youngest looked no older than 16, the oldest perhaps in her 40s, though exact ages were uncertain. Each showed visible signs of illness, thin limbs, irregular posture, and an almost uniform expression of vacancy. Officers radioed for medical assistance. The barn's floor was cleared, photographs taken immediately. None of the women resisted contact. When asked simple questions, they either looked away or murmured indistinctly. One reached toward the doorway as if unused to the light. Paramedics documented vitals on scene. All were dehydrated but stable enough for transport. By noon, the area was cordoned off under forensic control. Investigators began cataloging the environment: food tins, a single water barrel, scraps of bedding, a lantern without fuel. The sheriff's report later described the structure as a sealed living space containing multiple individuals in advanced neglect. The women were moved to Salem General Hospital for evaluation, while state authorities initiated a full property investigation. What began as an anonymous welfare call would, within days, evolve into one of the most disturbing cases in Oregon's modern record. The Ward property was no longer abandoned. It had been occupied all along, hidden in plain sight. By the time the first forensic team reached the Ward property, word had already spread through the sheriff's network that the situation involved multiple victims. The barn, now opened and ventilated, was declared an active containment zone. No unauthorized personnel were permitted inside. Investigators entered wearing respirators and gloves, recording every square foot with slow precision. 7 women were confirmed on site. Their ages spanned more than 3 decades, from late adolescence to advanced middle age. None bore any form of identification. Their speech was minimal, their comprehension uncertain. Medical staff noted distinct physical traits shared among them: asymmetrical facial structures, irregular limb proportions, and underdeveloped muscle tone. Several displayed polydactyly, extra digits on hands or feet, along with congenital deformities in the spine and jaw. The barn's interior measured roughly 22 feet wide and 40 feet deep. Ceiling boards sagged under their own weight, darkened by moisture and soot. Along one wall lay a line of makeshift bedding, torn blankets atop straw and cloth remnants. A large metal drum served as a water source. The liquid inside was stagnant and tinted green. Near the center, a broken lantern and a crate of tin cans were found, their contents long expired. There were no modern appliances, no visible heating system, and no evidence of external power. Ventilation existed only through small gaps near the rafters. One investigator described the air as heavy, unmoving, layered. Windows had been boarded shut from the inside, leaving only narrow seams of light that revealed dust suspended in the air. A single wooden ladder led to a low platform overhead, possibly used for storage, though none of the victims appeared capable of climbing it. Paramedics conducted initial triage within the doorway to avoid further contamination. All 7 women were severely malnourished, with average body weights below 60 pounds. Skin abrasions indicated long-term friction from coarse fabric and uneven flooring. Despite visible illness, none showed signs of recent physical assault. Vital signs were recorded. Intravenous fluids were administered immediately before transport. The sheriff's team established a perimeter and designated separate entry and exit zones for personnel. Soil samples and air readings were taken. A coroner was called to inspect 2 small burial mounds behind the structure, each covered by rough stones. Within hours, the barn was classified as both a medical and criminal scene. Sheriff Colburn addressed the assembled investigators before departing for the hospital. The evidence suggested not a transient crime, but an extended, organized system of isolation. Early estimates placed the confinement at multiple generations. The structure's interior, its improvised supplies, and the shared physical traits among the women all pointed to a controlled lineage rather than unrelated victims. As dusk fell, the property was sealed under state jurisdiction. The surrounding land, stretching several acres, was placed under active surveillance to prevent interference. Within 24 hours, a joint task force was formed to analyze what was quickly being labeled the ward enclosure. The women's removal marked the end of their captivity, but for investigators, it was only the beginning of understanding what had occurred inside that barn for decades unseen. The investigation into the ward property began to shift focus from the immediate scene to the paper trail that surrounded it. Within days, clerks from the county recorder's office were brought in to assemble any trace of ownership, family history, or residential documentation linked to the land. Their findings outlined a century-long pattern of withdrawal. The earliest available deed, dated May 12, 1903, listed the property under the name Elias Ward, a farmer and former mill worker from eastern Oregon. Tax filings from that decade indicated modest crop production and livestock sales, but by 1921, all commercial activity ceased. Census data that year noted the household as self-sufficient, limited contact. No subsequent entries appeared. For the ward name after 1930, the property remained registered but functionally invisible. Birth. Certificates retrieved from the county archive revealed anomalies. Several infants born under the Ward surname between 1925 and 1958 shared nearly identical parental information. Some certificates listed fathers or mothers with the same forenames, and others left those fields blank. When state welfare agents attempted routine follow-ups in the 1960s, they found no trace of any Ward family members at public schools or medical facilities. The reports were marked unverified occupancy and later archived without resolution. Local parish ledgers offered a parallel silence. Baptismal records for the surrounding district included no ward entries after 1934. Neighbors, few and distant, remembered the family only in passing. Occasional sightings of a man collecting supplies from a feed store, or a wagon seen once every few years. After the 1970s, even those recollections faded. The property effectively vanished from social and institutional view. A search of school district files uncovered an unopened envelope dated March 2, 1959, addressed to the ward residents. It was a notification of truancy concerning 2 unnamed minors. The letter was returned months later, stamped "address vacant." From that year forward, no further outreach attempts were recorded. By the 1980s, the ward farm had been classified as inactive agricultural land, exempt from inspection due to its private status. Investigators also reviewed medical and hospital indexes. There were no recorded admissions, births, or deaths attributed to any member of the ward family within the county for more than half a century. Property taxes had been paid in irregular intervals, small amounts sent through money orders with no sender listed. The last payment, issued in 1994, came from a postal office 90 miles away. Through these documents, a lineage began to take shape. One family systematically severing all external ties, generation after generation, until official systems ceased acknowledging their existence. What emerged from the records was less a family tree than a closed circuit, a pattern of repeated names, missing data, and vanished oversight. When compiled into a timeline, the evidence showed that the Ward family had not simply been forgotten. They had methodically erased themselves from public record. What investigators encountered in the barn was not an isolated tragedy, but the endpoint of deliberate concealment, sustained quietly for nearly a century. Among the items recovered from the Ward property were 13 composition notebooks, stored in a wooden trunk sealed beneath the upper platform of the barn. Each book was numbered and dated in Elias Ward's handwriting, spanning nearly 3 decades. The entries, while fragmented, provided investigators with the clearest outline of how the household functioned and how one man maintained control over an entire lineage. Elias Ward described himself in early entries as the keeper of order. The family structure revolved around his authority. He assigned labor, determined sleeping arrangements, and distributed food rations according to what he referred to as merit. Outside contact was prohibited. Communication with anyone beyond the property required his written consent, which was never granted. Every word spoken, every action taken was subject to his review. The notebooks contained detailed schedules written in block letters. Each day was divided into increments of labor, instruction, and silence. Mornings began at dawn with assigned tasks, tending to livestock, cleaning, or repairing the structure. Evenings were dedicated to recitation of what Elias called house lessons. These lessons included reading, arithmetic, and domestic practice, all limited to materials he approved. He controlled every aspect of education, ensuring that knowledge circulated only through him. Food and water distribution followed a ledger system. Each family member's name was listed beside exact quantities of grain, vegetables, or canned goods received per week. Infractions, speaking out of turn, withholding labor, or attempting to question his rules were met with deductions from these rations. The system left no ambiguity. Sustenance depended entirely on obedience. Punishments were logged in a separate section. The language was methodical, unemotional. Each entry noted the offense, the duration of restriction, and the corrective measure imposed. Restrictions included isolation, removal of bedding, or confinement within a side enclosure for predetermined hours. Physical punishment was rare but implied. One entry, dated November 3, 1982, reads simply, "Correction applied. Behavior restored." Caleb Ward, Elias's younger brother, appeared frequently in these records. Initially, he served as assistant and caretaker, executing Elias's instructions. His handwriting occasionally replaced Elias's in the later volumes, suggesting that he took over maintenance of the logs when Elias's health declined. The tone of Caleb's entries shifted over time, from compliance to hesitation. Later notes included incomplete sentences and crossed-out passages, as if written under pressure. Investigators compared Elias's handwriting to public documents from earlier decades. The same deliberate style appeared on property forms and payment receipts, reinforcing his role as the sole point of contact between the family and the outside world. There were no signs of collaborative decision-making within the household. His presence dictated every process, from education to punishment to access to air and light. Blueprint fragments found in the trunk depicted the barn's internal layout. Measurements were annotated with terms such as boundary, containment, and order zone. These notes confirmed that the building was never intended for farming. It was a controlled environment designed to enforce isolation and hierarchy. Built by Elias himself with the assistance of his brother. By the time investigators assembled the evidence, a portrait of systematic control had emerged. Elias Ward had not ruled by violence but by structure. Through routine, deprivation, and absolute oversight, he transformed a family home into an engineered system of obedience, one that endured long after he was gone. The architectural survey of the Ward barn began 2 days after its discovery. Engineers and forensic examiners conducted a complete structural analysis, treating the site not as a residence, but as an engineered environment. Every modification reflected intent, each alteration aimed at limiting access, movement, and exposure to the outside world. The building measured 42 feet in length and just over 21 feet wide. Reinforced timber beams, double-layered along the walls, had been secured with steel pins rather than nails. The entrance doors, 2 heavy planks bolted from the inside, were built to withstand force, their surfaces scarred from repeated attempts at entry or escape. Investigators identified at least 5 separate locking systems installed over the decades, each stronger than the last. There were no exterior windows. Instead, narrow wooden slats near the roofline provided minimal airflow. Behind those slats, a concealed ventilation shaft connected to a vertical duct running through the north wall. The duct's opening led to a narrow grate disguised beneath an overhang of soil and brush. This was the only pathway through which fresh air entered. Carbon residue around the vent suggested that the mechanism had been used for years, its filtration replaced manually from inside. The lower level contained 7 narrow sleeping areas, each marked by flattened straw or folded cloth, arranged symmetrically along the east wall. Opposite them stood a single workbench, a rusted basin, and remnants of a hand-cranked water pump. Pipes from the pump fed into a small storage tank embedded beneath the flooring. Tests later confirmed that groundwater had been drawn from a shallow aquifer directly below the structure, evidence that the family had developed a self-contained water supply, independent of external plumbing. Lighting was achieved through a rudimentary electrical circuit powered by a bicycle generator. The generator's placement near the ladder indicated that one person was responsible for operating it, while the others performed daily chores. Investigators reconstructed wiring diagrams found in Elias Ward's trunk, showing careful planning. Circuits protected by wooden casings to prevent tampering. Switches positioned out of reach from lower sleeping areas. Above the living quarters, the upper level served as Elias's workspace. The floor plan included a desk, storage crates, and an array of ledgers positioned under a small kerosene lamp. Walls had been reinforced with additional boards to reduce noise transfer. One corner held a narrow viewing slit directed toward the lower section, an observation point designed for monitoring movement below without direct contact. Scattered near the desk were medical remnants, empty vials, handwritten dosage notes, and fragments of sterile packaging predating the 1980s. Samples collected from glass containers tested positive for common antibiotics and sedatives, none of which matched prescriptions registered locally. Combined with improvised medical charts found nearby, investigators concluded that routine health maintenance had been performed within the barn for years without outside assistance. The cumulative design showed deliberate forethought. Each layer of construction addressed endurance and control, airflow without openness, light without escape, sustenance without dependence. Nothing inside the barn appeared improvised. Every adjustment, every nail, hinge, and partition served the purpose of sustaining confinement indefinitely. At the close of the structural survey, inspectors traced one final feature: a concealed crawl space beneath the floorboards, containing weathered ledgers wrapped in canvas. Their pages, still legible, detailed supply inventories and names written in sequence across several decades. Those documents would form the foundation of the next phase of the investigation. The reconstruction of the Ward family's hidden history, buried not just in walls, but in records. Once the physical survey concluded, the investigation shifted from the barn to the paper record. A team from the state's historical registry was tasked with reconstructing the Ward family's administrative footprint, an effort to determine when the lineage began to slip beneath official oversight. The process took weeks, unfolding through clerical persistence rather than revelation. Each document added a fragment to a story that had been hidden in plain sight. County repositories yielded the first clues. Within basement storage at the Salem courthouse, clerks located brittle birth certificates registered under multiple variations of the Ward surname. Ink faded, signatures inconsistent, each entry carried small irregularities, mismatched dates, incomplete parent names, and duplicate registrations years apart. Among them were at least 4 certificates marked stillborn, all attributed to the same father, Elias Ward, but issued across nearly 2 decades. No attending physician was listed on any. Death ledgers were thinner. Between 1930 and 1970, only one Ward death had been formally processed. A woman named Clara Ward, recorded without age or cause. Her burial location was marked private grounds. Cross-referencing property indexes revealed that the notation corresponded directly with the Ward acreage, confirming internal burials never reported to the county. Parallel inquiries into school and census archives uncovered similar gaps. Federal enumeration logs from 1950 included the Ward residence under Unverified Agricultural Unit. The next census, 10 years later, omitted the address entirely. Church registries followed the same pattern. Baptism, marriage, and funeral listings for neighboring families continued through the 1960s, but the Ward column stopped abruptly after 1967. No explanation or follow-up appeared in parish minutes. The State Land Office confirmed continuous property tax payments, though inconsistently timed. Some payments arrived late by years, yet none were contested. The signature line always bore the same name, E. Ward, written in the same deliberate script across decades. Records indicated that all correspondence had been handled through postal money orders, eliminating any physical trace of the sender. During the second week of examination, investigators catalogued a separate source of data, the ledgers recovered from beneath the barn floorboards. These handwritten volumes extended the official record where bureaucracy had failed. Inside, Elias Ward had chronicled every household event, births, deaths, food inventory, and seasonal cycles. Crude genealogies filled multiple pages, names branching and repeating without external verification. Each new entry included weight, height, and brief notes labeled viable or non-viable. The handwriting remained steady, suggesting a meticulous, lifelong system of tracking. Comparing state and private documents revealed how the family had operated entirely within its own record-keeping structure. Where government files ended, Elias's ledgers began. Every institutional absence aligned precisely with a corresponding internal entry, as though he had substituted his authority for the state's. When assembled chronologically, the archives illustrated a full withdrawal from external accountability. The Ward family had not simply lived in seclusion. They had replicated the framework of bureaucracy itself behind locked doors. Property deeds, private genealogies, and unregistered life events formed a closed network of paperwork, each line reinforcing the illusion of legitimacy. By the conclusion of the archival review, investigators recognized that the family's disappearance from civic systems was neither neglect nor oversight. It was procedure, designed, maintained, and renewed by the patriarch to replace the public record with his own. The 7 women removed from the Ward property were transported under medical supervision to Salem General Hospital, where an emergency intake unit was assembled overnight. Physicians, genetic counselors, and trauma specialists convened to perform initial examinations. Each patient was assigned a coded identification number rather than a name to preserve confidentiality during the early evaluation phase. Physical assessments began immediately. Examiners noted that none of the women displayed evidence of recent injury, yet all exhibited severe chronic malnutrition. Skeletal scans revealed widespread deformities, curved spines, joint displacement, and abnormal bone density consistent with nutritional deficiency sustained over years. Cardiologists recorded irregular heart rhythms in 4 of the subjects, while pulmonary evaluations indicated underdeveloped lung capacity. Blood tests confirmed anemia and low immune resistance across the group. Beyond the physical findings, physicians observed striking similarities in facial structure, dental spacing, and hair texture, suggesting a narrow hereditary base. Genetic sampling was authorized but deferred until stabilization. Neurological evaluations conducted over several days revealed cognitive impairments ranging from mild disorientation to complete dependency. The younger women displayed limited vocabulary, often responding to direct questions with repetition or silence. Motor coordination varied, with several showing tremors or difficulty maintaining balance. Psychological staff documented uniform behavioral traits. Startle responses were immediate and exaggerated. Eye contact was brief, typically avoided. None of the women showed aggression or outward fear. Instead, their affect remained subdued, almost mechanical. When given meals, they waited for instruction before eating, as though conditioned to request permission. Despite exhaustion, most refused to sleep until lights remained on, an inversion of normal rest behavior attributed to prolonged darkness during confinement. One subject, later identified as Ruth Ward, emerged as the eldest and most coherent. She demonstrated partial recall of household routines, food preparation, cleaning tasks, and a system of hand signals used for silent communication. Her speech was fragmented, shaped by limited exposure to language beyond her family circle. She referred to Elias as Father Ward and described daily reading hours that corresponded to the notebooks recovered from the property. When asked about others no longer present, she offered no detail, only stating that they were corrected. Clinical teams estimated that the lineage extended through approximately 5 generations. The shared physical and cognitive markers aligned with hereditary concentration over several decades, though official genetic confirmation was still pending. The medical board concluded that isolation had not only restricted physical health, but had replaced developmental learning with behavioral conditioning, each generation teaching survival within confinement as the norm. Within a week, all 7 women were transferred to a specialized state care facility equipped for long-term monitoring. Each was assigned a multidisciplinary treatment team consisting of physicians, social workers, and rehabilitation therapists. The focus shifted from immediate stabilization to slow adaptation, introducing natural light, varied diet, and gradual exposure to speech and movement outside institutional control. Progress was uneven but measurable. Some began to mimic ordinary gestures within days. Others remained largely unresponsive. Their condition, while critical, was considered survivable with consistent care. Officials summarized the case in clinical terms: 7 individuals exhibiting multi-generational physical and psychological impairment resulting from extended environmental and genetic isolation. The hospital's final intake report closed with a brief notation from the attending supervisor: all survivors are stable. Long-term evaluation required. It was the first formal acknowledgement that the Ward lineage had survived its enclosure, and that their existence could now be observed, not hidden. Following the initial hospital stabilization, all biological material collected from the Ward survivors was transferred under controlled custody to the Department of Genetics at the University of Oregon, where Dr. Collins and his research team were authorized to perform a comprehensive forensic analysis. The purpose was twofold: to establish the degree of hereditary compression within the Ward lineage and to evaluate the environmental impact of prolonged confinement. Samples were catalogued with chain-of-custody verification. Blood, hair, and tissue specimens underwent polymerase chain reaction amplification to compare allelic variation across subjects. Within weeks, the results confirmed an unprecedented genetic overlap. Mitochondrial sequencing showed near-identical markers across 5 generations, producing an inbreeding coefficient higher than any previously recorded in documented U.S. cases. The statistical probability of such concentration occurring naturally was effectively zero, demonstrating deliberate reproductive isolation sustained over decades. Dr. Collins' report detailed the methodology in neutral language. Each genome was measured against national control databases to assess genetic diversity. The ward subjects exhibited severe allelic reduction, less than 40% of expected heterozygosity for their demographic group. This reduction correlated directly with observed congenital conditions, skeletal malformation, cardiac irregularities, and immune suppression. The findings established a quantifiable link between lineage restriction and physiological decline. Parallel examinations addressed environmental degradation. Soil and air samples collected from beneath the barn flooring contained elevated ammonia and fungal spores associated with poor ventilation and organic waste accumulation. Chemical residue matched oxidized metals and candle soot, confirming that respiration over many years occurred in an oxygen-limited environment. The contamination levels corresponded to symptoms seen in the survivors: respiratory inefficiency and chronic infection patterns. A multidisciplinary panel cross-referenced these results with environmental health data. The correlation between confined air quality and biological stress indicators was consistent across all individuals. Metabolic readings demonstrated malnutrition exceeding 20 years in duration for the eldest subject, aligning with the chronological estimates established through property records. In coordination with the State Forensic Unit, the university compiled a formal publication under the title Genetic and Environmental Outcomes of Multi-Generational Isolation in a Closed Population. The paper appeared later that year in the American Journal of Medical Genetics. Peer reviewers validated its authenticity, citing it as the first complete dataset linking extreme consanguinity with environmental deprivation under controlled confinement. The study's appendices included comparative charts showing generational decline in stature, immunity, and reproductive viability. State investigators concluded from the compiled evidence that the ward confinement had been neither accidental nor temporary. The barn's design, the internal record-keeping, and the genetic results together demonstrated a pattern of methodical isolation maintained across successive generations. Each outcome, biological, physical, and environmental, reflected intention, planning, and endurance. Dr. Collins summarized the data in the final review statement submitted to the Attorney General's office. This population's genetic compression cannot be attributed to neglect. It represents a sustained and closed breeding strategy executed over multiple lifespans. The conclusion left little ambiguity. What the rescuers had uncovered was not a neglected household, but a controlled hereditary experiment conducted in complete seclusion. The evidence transformed the Ward case from a human tragedy into a matter of scientific record, an enduring benchmark in the study of deliberate genetic isolation. Among the written materials recovered from the Ward property, none offered more insight into motive than the notebooks devoted to Elias Ward's personal belief system. These volumes differed from the household ledgers and punishment logs. They were written in a tone of conviction rather than instruction. Handwriting analysts identified them as private compositions, never meant for others to read. Their content provided investigators with a direct view into the ideology that sustained the family's isolation. Elias referred to his philosophy as the preservation. In his entries, he described humanity as corrupted by external contact and believed that purity, both spiritual and physical, could be restored through selective confinement. The Ward lineage, in his mind, represented a chosen line tasked with maintaining what he called original essence. To him, external society posed contamination. Isolation was protection. His conviction fused misinterpreted scripture with early 20th century eugenic language, producing a doctrine that blurred faith, pseudoscience, and personal delusion. Each entry followed a structured format, a quotation from religious text, followed by a reinterpretation in his own words. He claimed that the line of truth must remain unbroken, a phrase repeated throughout the journals. Within that framework, family members were categorized not as individuals, but as successions, each generation serving as a continuation of the last. The use of impersonal terms indicated that Elias viewed reproduction as a functional process, not a human relationship. Investigators noted that his doctrine was self-reinforcing. He recorded both doubt and justification within the same passages, often writing rhetorical questions only to answer them in affirmation of his purpose. "If one strays from the design," he wrote in a 1974 entry, "the design itself decays." The repetition of such phrases demonstrated a closed cognitive loop, feeding belief without external correction. To rationalize the family's complete isolation, Elias employed a vocabulary of duty. He claimed obedience to a higher law superseding civil governance. His doctrine stated that the outside governs by weakness, the inside governs by order. It became evident to analysts that this ideology had not evolved from theological study, but from self-taught distortion. Each reinterpretation of Scripture served to validate his authority as interpreter and executor. Forensic linguists reviewing the notebooks observed consistent lexical patterns associated with systemized delusion, repetition of key nouns, fixation on purity, and an absence of emotional language when referencing human suffering. Psychological consultants later concluded that Elias's writings exhibited features of a personality system built around absolute control, delusional, but coherent within its own structure. Notably, his notes contained detailed reflections on the act of isolation itself. He considered seclusion an offering, an act of purification rather than punishment. When describing the construction of the barn, he wrote that it ensures continuity through silence. The phrase became central to understanding his mindset. Silence was not oppression, but sanctity. By the time the final notebooks were analyzed, investigators classified the writings not as theology, but as pathological conviction. Psychiatrists labeled the material delusional systemization, an organized but irrational belief sustained by repetition and isolation. The doctrine provided no divine revelation, only justification for control. Through these pages, Elias Ward ceased to appear as a mysterious patriarch and emerged as what he was, an architect of ideology who replaced faith with design. His conviction had outlasted reason, shaping every rule, every birth, and every silence within the walls he built. By the late 1990s, the Ward enclosure had already entered its final phase of decline. Evidence assembled after recovery indicated that the patriarch, Elias Ward, died several years before the rescue operation. His death was neither recorded nor reported. The probable cause, according to post-mortem medical reconstruction, was a combination of untreated infection and malnutrition. Without medical aid, his condition deteriorated gradually until bodily collapse. His passing marked the beginning of the structure's disintegration from within. Control shifted to Caleb Ward, the only adult male remaining. For a short period, the family's daily order continued, sustained by routine rather than authority. The surviving notebooks show a sudden change in handwriting and tone. Entries became inconsistent, supplies no longer logged with precision. Caleb attempted to replicate his brother's procedures, but lacked his rigidity and organization. Within months, inventory tracking stopped entirely. Food distribution became erratic. Tasks once performed on schedule grew irregular and incomplete. As resources thinned, living conditions degraded. The water pump produced less flow each week, and stored grain began to spoil. The small underground tank that once supplied fresh water turned stagnant. Air circulation through the ventilation shaft weakened as dust and decay accumulated. Illness followed quickly. Skin infections, respiratory distress, and fever spread through the enclosed group. With no external assistance and no concept of intervention, the women retreated into passivity. Survival became mechanical, dictated by exhaustion and repetition. Caleb's later entries, written in short sentences and uneven script, reflected the unraveling of order. Phrases such as light gone, pump broken, and too weak appeared repeatedly. No attempts to seek help were recorded. Burial notes began appearing alongside ration tallies, each entry marked only by initials. Investigators later located shallow graves behind the barn aligned in a single row, consistent with those notations. The remains corresponded to family members who had vanished from Elias's earlier genealogies. The final pages of the last notebook end abruptly. The handwriting falters midway through a sentence describing the loss of the eldest of the second line. Analysts determined that the writing tool snapped under pressure, leaving a gouge in the paper. No additional records follow. The family's collapse had become total, communication ceased, maintenance stopped, and isolation shifted from controlled to terminal. The chain of events that led authorities to the property began outside the family's reach. In early 1997, a relative residing in eastern Oregon, identified through genealogical records as a distant cousin, attempted to re-establish contact after decades of silence. Letters sent to the ward address went unanswered. Concern over unpaid taxes and inactivity led him to notify the county office, which in turn referred the case to local law enforcement. By the time deputies arrived, only 7 members of the household remained alive. Everything else, the routines, the ledgers, the illusion of order, had deteriorated into stillness. The barn that once operated as a controlled environment had turned into a tomb sustained by inertia. The Ward family's world did not end through intervention or rebellion, but through exhaustion. When the doors were finally breached, the isolation that had defined them no longer held purpose. It had simply run out of life. The morning after the survivors' removal, state officials authorized a full-scale operation to secure and process the Ward property. Emergency custody orders were issued by the Marion County Circuit Court, granting law enforcement complete authority over all remaining assets, materials, and structures. The site was reclassified from local jurisdiction to a multi-agency investigation zone involving the Oregon State Police, the Department of Human Services, and federal observers from the Department of Justice's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Sheriff Colburn directed the operation personally. His first act was to establish a dual perimeter system, an inner zone limited to forensic personnel and an outer boundary for security and media exclusion. Access logs recorded every individual entering or exiting the property, each required to sign under time-stamped verification. The purpose was containment, both physical and evidentiary. Nothing from the site was to be disturbed without full documentation. Forensic teams commenced cataloging at 0700 hours. Every item, from the smallest utensil to the largest structural beam, was photographed, tagged, and assigned a numeric identifier. Evidence technicians used a grid mapping system to record spatial coordinates for each artifact. The notebooks, ledgers, and letters were sealed in anti-static containers for transport to the State Archive facility. Even organic remnants, soil samples, fabric fibers, and air particulates were preserved for laboratory analysis. The catalog eventually spanned more than 6,000 entries. Structural engineers followed, examining the barn's composition with precision instruments. They identified retrofitted joints, layered supports, and concealed reinforcements inconsistent with agricultural use. The discovery of embedded ventilation channels, soundproofed panels, and water conduits confirmed the structure's purpose as an isolation environment rather than a storage facility. Each modification was logged and cross-referenced with Elias Ward's construction notes recovered earlier. Simultaneously, investigators executed a property sweep using metal detection and ground-penetrating radar. Subsurface anomalies were located in 3 sectors, corresponding to burial sites behind the barn. These were marked, excavated under controlled conditions, and transported to the medical examiner's office. Every recovery followed forensic chain of custody protocol, verified by signature from both county and federal representatives. Inside the farmhouse, a secondary team handled administrative evidence. Financial records, correspondence, and payment receipts were extracted from drawers and filing cabinets. The documents, though limited, showed consistent payments of property taxes and supply purchases, proof that Elias maintained minimal legal compliance to avoid attention. His transactions were sparse but deliberate, each one reinforcing the illusion of a functioning homestead. By afternoon, the property had been stabilized and officially sealed. An incident command post was erected at the perimeter, coordinating communications among agencies. Federal officials announced a joint review to identify prior oversight failures, including unaddressed welfare and census irregularities dating back 50 years. This audit marked the first formal recognition that systemic neglect had enabled the Ward isolation to persist. Undetected for generations, all collected material was transferred under federal custody within 48 hours. The final inventory, numbered, indexed, and archived, became the foundation for subsequent criminal proceedings, academic studies, and legal reform discussions. The intervention was not a rescue in the cinematic sense. It was an exercise in containment and accountability. When the last vehicle left the site that evening, the Ward property stood silent again, but this time every silence had been recorded, every shadow measured, and every artifact preserved. The structure that once concealed a family's secrecy had been fully exposed to public record. The case of State of Oregon versus Caleb Ward commenced on February 4, 1998, in the Marion County Superior Court. By this stage, Caleb was the sole surviving adult male of the Ward lineage and the only individual deemed legally competent to stand trial. The prosecution's central argument established him not as a passive participant, but as the active custodian who perpetuated confinement after Elias Ward's death. Charges included unlawful imprisonment, criminal neglect resulting in death, and obstruction of state oversight. Each count reflected sustained conduct rather than isolated events. The indictment outlined a timeline of actions taken by Caleb following his brother's death: ration distribution, burial of deceased members, and continued enforcement of confinement. These were presented as evidence of intent and continuation of a structured system rather than inherited obedience. Court proceedings were methodical. Over several weeks, prosecutors presented a chronological record of the Ward enclosure: property photographs, structural diagrams, and excerpts from the ledgers recovered during investigation. Forensic experts from the University of Oregon verified that the barn's modifications aligned with long-term containment design. Each testimony was introduced through sworn affidavits to limit speculation. Dr. Collins, representing the Genetic Research Division, summarized findings that demonstrated generational isolation sustained well beyond Elias's lifetime. Defense counsel argued coercion and psychological dependency, asserting that Caleb functioned under learned obedience established through decades of control. They claimed he lacked independent decision-making capacity and acted out of conditioned fear. However, the prosecution countered with physical evidence suggesting autonomy: records showing Caleb's own handwriting, financial transactions post-dating Elias's death, and recent entries in the family logs that used first-person directives rather than subordinate phrasing. Witness testimony from medical staff further reinforced the prosecution's case. Attending physicians described the survivor's physical deterioration as a direct result of ongoing confinement during Caleb's oversight. Forensic pathologists presented analysis of remains recovered from the burial sites, each interment consistent with a timeline extending beyond Elias's confirmed year of death. Collectively, the evidence portrayed a sustained pattern of isolation rather than an abrupt collapse. The trial attracted national media coverage, though cameras were barred from the courtroom. Journalists referred to it as the Ward enclosure case, drawing comparisons to historic neglect prosecutions. Public sentiment alternated between pity and outrage, but the proceedings themselves remained disciplined and procedural. Each argument, objection, and cross-examination was recorded verbatim for state archival purposes. On April 20, 1998, the jury delivered a unanimous verdict. Caleb Ward was convicted on all primary counts and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. In issuing the judgment, Judge Hensley described his actions as the perpetuation of captivity through silence and routine, emphasizing the absence of remorse or intervention even after the means to seek help became available. Caleb was transferred to Oregon State Penitentiary, where he remained under medical supervision due to chronic respiratory illness. Over the next decade, he gave no interviews and submitted no appeals. Prison records show minimal communication with outside parties. He died in custody in 2009, his death attributed to cardiac failure. With his passing, the state officially closed the criminal proceedings associated with the Ward case. What remained were the records, thousands of pages of testimony exhibits, and photographs preserved as a permanent judicial account of one family's systematic isolation, verified not through confession, but through evidence. In the years following the trial, the Ward case transitioned from criminal investigation to academic subject. The vast collection of materials, biological samples, psychological assessments, and structural documentation became the foundation for multiple cross-disciplinary reviews. Under controlled access agreements, universities and research institutions were permitted to examine selected data to better understand the social, genetic, and institutional mechanisms that had allowed the Ward lineage to persist unseen. The University of Oregon led the initial review. A consortium of geneticists, sociologists, and behavioral scientists reinterpreted the existing datasets, correlating lineage compression with psychosocial outcomes. Their publication, Isolated Generations, Hereditary Patterns in Closed Kin Populations, analyzed its consistency, neurodevelopmental markers, and environmental influence without sensationalizing its origin. The study established the Ward material as a baseline for evaluating long-term isolation within human populations, an unprecedented, if unsettling, case reference. Following this, ethics committees across federal and academic levels convened to assess how such confinement escaped state detection. The Department of Health and Human Services commissioned a review titled Oversight Gaps in Rural Welfare Monitoring, which used the Ward property timeline as a chronological model of systemic failure. The report emphasized data fragmentation between agencies, school districts, health registries, and social programs that had allowed decades of inactivity to pass unchallenged. The findings directly influenced subsequent legislation mandating cross-referencing between state welfare databases. Academic discourse expanded beyond genetics. Sociologists examined patterns of obedience and institutional neglect through the Ward family's behavioral records. Psychologists interpreted the survivors' case histories as evidence of generational conditioning, where isolation became normalized through repetition rather than coercion alone. These analyses collectively reframed the Ward case from an isolated atrocity to an intersection of biology, psychology, and social systems operating without external checks. In 2003, the University of Oregon established the Center for Multi-Generational Trauma Research, using anonymized Ward case data as one of its anchor references. The center's mission was not to revisit the family's suffering, but to understand the broader mechanisms of inherited trauma, adaptive behavior, and institutional blindness. Graduate programs across the country later incorporated the Ward archive into ethics and case methodology courses. It became a controlled example of what happens when administrative systems lose continuity and individuals vanish within bureaucratic margins. By the mid-2000s, international journals had cited the Ward case in studies addressing rural neglect, forensic anthropology, and the psychology of isolation. While the details remained restricted, its core findings circulated as a precedent for reform. Federal policy initiatives on welfare auditing, property inspection, and interdepartmental coordination traced their frameworks back to conclusions first drawn from this case. Today, the Ward archive remains classified as one of the most comprehensive datasets ever compiled on hereditary confinement. It stands as a permanent reference point for institutions confronting generational trauma, state oversight, and the consequences of administrative absence. The material continues to be interpreted not for its notoriety, but for its instructional value. Through research and reform, the Ward case moved from secrecy to documentation. Its transformation from hidden tragedy to public record ensured that the silence sustaining it for generations would never be replicated in ignorance again. In the months following the trial, the surviving members of the Ward family were transferred from temporary care facilities into the custody of the Oregon Department of Human Services. Each woman underwent comprehensive medical reevaluation before being placed under protective guardianship. Their files were sealed under new legal identities to prevent public exposure and media interference. This phase marked the transition from emergency response to long-term rehabilitation. Treatment was divided among 3 state-supervised institutions, each specializing in different aspects of recovery: neurological stabilization, physical therapy, and psychological adaptation. Progress was measured through quarterly evaluations rather than daily observation. Physicians recorded gradual weight gain, improved circulation, and measurable increases in muscle function. For many, walking unaided required months of retraining. Nutritional programs replaced the single-grain diets they had known with controlled, balanced intake designed to restore immune resilience without overstrain. Speech recovery presented the most persistent challenge. The women had communicated for decades through abbreviated words and gestures shaped by confinement. Speech therapists documented fragmented articulation, sentences without connective phrasing, vocabulary limited to domestic tasks. Intensive sessions focused on pattern repetition and contextual association rather than grammar. Over time, several patients began responding to conversational prompts, though none achieved full fluency. Their language acquisition plateaued at a functional level suitable for basic needs and routine interaction. Psychological evaluation revealed consistent traits of dependency and environmental disorientation. Clinical reports described the survivors as compliant but uncertain, displaying difficulty initiating activity without instruction. Many reacted to open spaces with visible discomfort. Therapists observed prolonged silence during outdoor sessions, followed by fatigue and withdrawal. Memory assessments showed large gaps. Whole periods of time absent from recall, replaced with fragmented impressions of repetition and sound. The absence of a sense of time was noted as one of the defining effects of their upbringing. Ruth Ward, the eldest and most communicative, became a focal point for rehabilitation documentation. Under supervised living arrangements, she participated in daily occupational exercises and limited community exposure programs. Progress reports indicated small but continuous improvement in adaptive behavior, independent eating, light gardening, and cooperation in group activities. Despite advancement, her comprehension of social structures remained minimal. When asked about her previous life, her responses stayed brief, measured in single words rather than narratives. By 2001, state agencies closed active medical oversight and transferred remaining care responsibilities to designated guardians. The women's new identities were fully integrated into the social services system, allowing them to receive health coverage, education, and counseling without public trace. None of them returned to the ward property. The land was legally absorbed into state ownership and later preserved as part of the case's historical archive. Ongoing follow-up reports over the next decade indicated stability rather than recovery. The women adapted to structured living environments but continued to rely on external scheduling for day-to-day continuity. Their lives proceeded quietly, defined not by reinvention but by maintenance. In official records, the aftercare program is summarized in one sentence. Subjects have adapted to sustained care with minimal distress and no regression. It was a concise acknowledgement of endurance rather than transformation. The survivors did not reclaim ordinary lives. They achieved permanence in safety, and for the first time in generations, their world extended beyond the walls that once contained them. In the years that followed, the Ward case shifted from tragedy to framework, its record serving as both caution and instruction. The investigation's outcomes became embedded within state policy, academic study, and forensic procedure. The property that once concealed a family's silence evolved into a reference point for how oversight fails and how it can be corrected. Legislative reform began within 2 years of the trial's conclusion. The Oregon Welfare Integrity Act of 2000 mandated routine welfare assessments for all registered rural households and introduced interdepartmental reporting protocols between education, health, and agricultural agencies. These reforms were directly modeled on the communication failures revealed by the Ward investigation. Similar measures were later adopted in other states, requiring automated cross-checks between tax, census, and welfare databases. Each new regulation bore a clear lineage, tracing back to a farm that no one had visited for decades. The Ward property itself was dismantled under controlled supervision. The barn's timber and steel fixtures were disassembled, sterilized, and preserved within the State Forensic Archive in Salem. Portions of its structure were reconstructed for instructional use at the Oregon State Forensic Training Center, where investigators and forensic students study the site's design as an example of prolonged concealment. The remains of tools, ledgers, and domestic objects are displayed only to accredited researchers. Public access is prohibited. Academically, the Ward Archive endures as one of the most frequently cited primary sources in the study of isolation and hereditary confinement. Its data appear in coursework on social ethics, anthropology, forensic science, and public administration. Each citation treats the material not as sensational, but as evidentiary, proof of what can persist when societal observation breaks down. Institutions worldwide reference the case as precedent when discussing hidden populations and generational trauma. Media treatment evolved in parallel. Early coverage had emphasized shock and morbidity, often overshadowing the systemic implications. Over time, that focus shifted toward documentation and analysis. Documentaries, peer-reviewed studies, and public records reconstructed the narrative with restraint, prioritizing verified detail over speculation. The Ward story ceased to function as spectacle. It became history, annotated and filed. For the state, the case remains open only in an administrative sense. Periodic audits revisit its files to ensure data preservation and continued compliance with privacy protections for the survivors, whose identities remain sealed. The official archive, spanning more than 27,000 pages, represents the most complete documentation of hereditary isolation in modern U.S. record-keeping. In 2015, a final review was commissioned to evaluate the long-term societal effects of the reforms initiated by the case. The concluding report, issued by the Oregon Historical Commission, ended not with policy recommendations, but with observation. Every system leaves its absence somewhere visible. The Ward file exists so that absence can no longer be ignored. The last page of the state's compiled dossier carries a single closing notation from the archival committee. All that remained was silence. It was not an epitaph for the family, but for the centuries of blindness that allowed them to remain unseen. A silence now permanently broken, recorded and preserved. If you've stayed with us to the end, let us know about how this case made you feel. Cases like the Ward family remind us that the most disturbing truths are often the ones hidden in plain sight. And if you'd like us to continue uncovering the lost, the forgotten, and the deliberately buried cases, make sure you're subscribed to the X Archives. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We read everyone. And if this episode stayed with you, share it so others can understand how easily history can vanish behind a locked door.